Hey everybody, this is John Slaughter with the Editor Extensions team. I wanted to give everyone a quick look at what we're working on currently with documentation as well as declaration of endpoints and messages, everything related to inbound and outbound messages to the language server and what we're doing today. So here's a little sneak peek at things that are probably going to be coming pretty soon. First off, I wanted to demonstrate that we have a new script for generating documentation. So if I do npm run generate documentation, we will get a nice little script that generates some new documentation inside of our docs directory. So we go docs API, and we will suddenly start seeing client to server schema.json, server to client schema.json, as well as client to server HTML and server to client HTML. I'm going to go over the schemas really quickly. So these are OpenAPI spec schemas. So anyone who's familiar with working with Swagger or the OpenAPI spec, you'll be very familiar with these. So we get our actual reusable set of schemas. So if we see something like prompt type would be something that we might reuse across multiple individual endpoint definitions. Active file context is something that we might use over multiple endpoint definitions. So these are models that are essentially defined that we referenced. We'd also see paths here. So we can see that we have a path for, $GitLab Duo Chat V2, new prompt, and then we get information about this. So this would actually be like an HTTP method, which we aren't using because we are in a JSON RPC scenario, and we're not using HTTP as our transport layer. But because we're using the OpenAPI spec, we're kind of bound by some of the HTTP verbiage that we can't quite get away from and still use a lot of the benefits of using the spec. So that might be a little strange, but it makes sense as we go. Cool. Let's actually open up one of the specs inside of a nice little Swagger document. So this is our server to client spec. This was actually generated from our schema, from this one here. And we can see that there's some schemas that were defined like active file context. We have paths like show message, insert code snippet, app ready, and we can go see all of those over here in the UI. So we get notifications and requests, show message, insert code snippet, app ready, get current file context. I can drill into any one of these, and I can see like get current file context has no parameters, but it expects a response. That response would be an active file context, which is a shared model, which we can find down here. We can also view the shared model up here and say, hey, file name is string, content above and below cursor are strings and they're nullable. And then we can do that for notifications as well for things like, show message, which I expect to see a type. And I think, let's see, what can type be? Yeah, it's an enum that can be either error, warning, or info, and then a message. So I modeled this directly off of what we're doing today in Chat V2. And let's go look at that right now, because I think that's beneficial as well. So I defined all of that inside of packages, WebView, Duo Chat V2, source, API. So this is a new directory underneath source. I kind of expect that something similar to this would exist in every module that's going to declare definitions for messages. And let's jump into the schema file as first. So I've got a schema.ts file, and the idea behind this is these are where you'd see shared models that you would see across multiple messages. These models that are things that we probably want to provide definitions or describe them so that we can provide some verbiage around what is this, how would this be used. We can also provide examples of, here's what a active file context might look like. And these are all things that we can then inject into our documentation so that it's easy for us to see, hey, this is everything that the language server is capable of outside of potentially just the normal language server protocol stuff. Excellent. I won't spend too much time on any one of these particular schemas, but happy to go over them in detail if anyone wants to chat about them. But I'm going to jump ahead to where I define the actual message definitions. So we have, for instance, client to server messages, and then we can see also here server to client messages. And on the client to server, we do this through we have a function called declare notification. We also have another one called declare request. Both of these return a notification or request builder. So we have methods on top of this, like with description, with params, and we would want to end this with a final .build. At the end of this thing, you would get a RPC message definition, in this case, an RPC notification definition. And we can also see this in the server to client messages where we actually do have a declare request. So for instance, we have a request called GitLab Duo Chat v2 get current file context. We have description. We say that the parameters are undefined, or we actually have a nice little thing called no params, which we should use instead, with response. Now the cool thing about this is I don't need this. This doesn't even need to be added at all, and it would still work fine. So the cool thing about the builder is that you do not need to have everything provided for this to be a valid either notification or request definition. So there's no invalid state for this. You can call build at any time, as long as the only thing that's necessary would be this method name, which is required inside of the declare notification or declare request function itself. Excellent. And then I know the next question is, okay, so I define all these notifications, I define these requests. How do I actually essentially tell my service or our app itself, these are things that we know about? And we're using DI everywhere throughout the language server, so this isn't really any different. We will have, for outbound messages, I would expect that, or server to client messages. There's probably some places where I've started to move away from inbound and outbound as naming conventions, and instead using server to client or client to server. So I'd expect this to change. But we actually have the concept of a message definition provider, where each provider has a function called get message definitions that would return an array of different definitions. In our case, we're injecting this, or we're saying that this is injectable as a server to client message definition provider. So these are all server to client messages. We don't have an analogous message definition provider for client to server, and the reason being is that any kind of client to server message, we'd expect to have a handler associated with it. We actually call that concept is called an endpoint. So we can define this with things like called endpoint providers, but there's an easier way to do this, and that's actually with controllers. And so I have this concept of a controller that you can make this an injectable. It says, hey, this is going to be an endpoint provider. Pass in whatever you want to it. DI resolves it just like it would any other normal class. But we have a decorator called endpoint, and that endpoint takes in RPC message definitions. So in this case, we said, let's do the new prompt notification. So if a new prompt comes in, we need to do things with it. We have a way of inferring parameters from an RPC notification or an RPC message definition. And so this is fully typed. So if I were to come in here and say something like, hey, params is a string, TypeScript is going to complain at me and tell me, hey, this is not a valid handler for what we know about over here. And of course, we also have validation on if you were to say I have multiple handlers for the same endpoint, that wouldn't work as well. We have some hard rules on one handler for one endpoint. Very controller. If anyone who's worked in sort of HTTP libraries, you're very much probably familiar with controllers and declaring endpoints in a manner similar to this. But we can do this in a super decentralized way now. So each module can kind of define, hey, these are controllers that I want to, this might be a controller that I want to handle certain notifications. And then I can also define that we are potentially able to push these types of notifications out to other things. Cool. So let's. So that's how these messages are defined and how they'd be able to be used, and how we generate documentation. So I want to give everyone just a quick peek on what's going on here. I expect to probably have a MR up with a lot of stuff on the doc generation side. Probably early tomorrow, and looking forward to any feedback. Thank you all for taking a look.